Got my friend Saifedean Ammous coming on. He's going to talk to you about how to kill Bitcoin. Let's give him a huge round of applause. Woo!
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me today. It is a pleasure to be in Riga, and I'm here to talk to you about the cheerful topic of how to kill Bitcoin, because we need more people to talk about Bitcoin dying. This is the one thing missing from the Bitcoin brand, so here we are. Now, of course, people generally have all kinds of vivid scenarios about how Bitcoin eventually dies. And, you know, government will ban it, government will stop it, or hackers will take it down. These are the sort of initial reactions that people generally have about Bitcoin. And these things can generally work and can have an effect, but it's not really clear that these things can actually kill Bitcoin off completely. And, you know, I'm not going to get into detail about the different kinds of technical and political attacks that are possible against Bitcoin, but I want to focus on the deep underlying economic reason why they generally fail at killing Bitcoin, or why they could fail at killing Bitcoin. And that's because Bitcoin is apolitical and uncensorable money. And therefore, any government controls or censorship against Bitcoin will simply advertise Bitcoin's value proposition. And so Bitcoin is telling you this is money the government can't control. And every time the government tries to control your money by telling you don't use Bitcoin, government is just telling you we control your money. And that, even if, you know, not directly, indirectly puts you in the frame of mind of thinking, wouldn't it be nice to have some form of money that the government doesn't control? And so these kinds of attacks foster the economic incentive for Bitcoin's success, essentially. And if they attack Bitcoin and they fail to kill it completely, then these kinds of attacks advertise its resilience. And therefore, governments become, you know, you could think that it's wiser to accept Bitcoin than to try and kill it and fail. And more generally, I would recommend looking at this great book, 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls, on attempts by government to try and ban or regulate the prices of different things, and how the market has always gone around government, and always governments have always failed at fighting prices. And, you know, here in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, we had a very vivid example of what happens when governments try to find prices. Government controls do not override human incentives. They simply change the costs, and people find a way to get what they want. Society is ultimately stronger than the state, because, you know, people have bonds with friends and family that are stronger than the control of the state, and through these bonds people are able to get around these kinds of controls, and eventually all kinds of economic restrictions fail because they fail to attack at economic incentives. And so, you know, today we can see this example with drugs. And the US fights an enormous war on drugs. Thousands of people die every year in Mexico because of the war on drugs. And drugs are more space intensive and more conspicuous than Bitcoin, and they're still available in places where they are illegal. And, you know, we see black markets emerge, and we see this with Bitcoin already. You know, people here have spoken about all kinds of different innovations that are being introduced into Bitcoin. We see many layers of redundancy, and we see how any kind of restriction will only simply lead to more innovation. And we see people coming up with things like mesh networks and radio, and all of the innovations we see with Bitcoin hardware and software. Essentially, the more government controls and government attacks there are on Bitcoin, the more innovation you will see of people trying to get around them. And effectively, the more ingenious people will become in trying to fight them. And that's really the real problem with these attacks on Bitcoin. And that's why, you know, the technical attacks, in a sense, miss the fact that the defenders or the Bitcoiners can think of ways to react to any particular ban and to get around it, as markets always do throughout history. And so this then, for me, suggests that as long as the economic incentive to use Bitcoin exists, then people will do their best to use Bitcoin. And on the other hand, we see that the worse the money is, the people will be driven more and more towards using Bitcoin. So governments, they can't dictate economic reality. They can't just force people away from Bitcoin, but they can influence it through their choice of the monetary and financial and banking system and services that they offer to their people. Effectively, they can either amplify the economic incentive to use Bitcoin through placing restrictions on money transfer and on banking and through engaging in inflation, or they can weaken it through doing the opposite. In other words, rather than trying to stop people from using Bitcoin, governments, if they really wanted to kill Bitcoin, they should really think about eliminating the economic incentive that people have to use Bitcoin. How do you do that? Well, you improve your monetary and financial policies to the point where Bitcoin isn't needed. If you do that, you take away the incentive that people have for using Bitcoin. And so the better the monetary and the financial policies, the less the incentive people have for using Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin becomes easier to kill, perhaps. So here is one attack vector that I would like to present to you. It's from the old history books, something called the International Gold Standard. It's like the Bitcoin standard, but it's ancient. It's the original centralized alternative to statist central banking. And it's not exactly like Bitcoin, but for a period between 1870 and about 1914, when this was the dominant monetary system in the world, it worked wonderfully. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. There was no hyperinflation recorded anywhere. Price inflation, or the increase in prices, was around 0% per year. Sometimes it was -1, sometimes it was -2, sometimes it was +1, +2. Basically, it's a meaningless metric anyway. It doesn't really mean anything, but effectively back then, prices didn't really rise. There was no real inflation. There was very little business cycles unless the government started interfering with the central bank. People had much more individual freedom. There was far less of a nanny state. There was no surveillance state in that time. And you have to, and for me, of course, you have to draw the link between all of those things and the monetary system, because it is because of the monetary system that all of these agencies of the state are able to carry out all of this level of control. In terms of wars, this was a period of peace and limited war, because governments being financed by gold means that they can't just print money to fight wars. And in terms of drugs, think about it back then, it was unheard of anyway that there would be a war on drugs. Drugs were just, they were frowned upon socially, and people didn't use them in public, and people who used them were ostracized, but they were still legal. You could go and buy drugs from a pharmacy, and it was not something that you could go to jail for. And there was no income tax, and so there was no financial reporting on everything. You didn't have to report all of your income on everything to the government. You didn't have to hand out all of your information to your local bank and government so that all of your local criminals will eventually hack into it and know everything about you. These things didn't exist. Your relationship with your bank was just your relationship with the bank, and the relationship was far more decentralized because it all rested on gold. And government ability to finance itself and finance the stupid things that it does was severely compromised by the fact that it couldn't just print gold. And so if we had something like this, I wonder, do you think, if let's say we had the political and economic institutions of the year 1908, if we had them in 2008, would Satoshi have even created Bitcoin? It's an interesting question. Would all of the people that have worked on Bitcoin since then have been as interested and as involved in working on Bitcoin if we had been living under the international gold standard of 1908 in 2008? It's a very interesting question. Ask yourself maybe about your own individual motivations for being into Bitcoin, and whether, how many people here today would be here if the world didn't have many of these problems that it has today, but it didn't have in 1908. Would there be such, and I think more accurately or more specifically to the topic of today's talk, specifically, would there be as much of an incentive to innovate, to save Bitcoin, and to prevent Bitcoin from being attacked? Would there be so much incentive to run your own node, make sure that you run the software, that you know your own software, and so on? Innovating all these ways to get around government controls. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a question well worth considering. And I think it helps us understand one other failure mode, in a sense, of Bitcoin, which isn't discussed enough, in my opinion, which is the failure that comes from the failure of Bitcoin on a free market to compete with other forms of money. And the thing is, currently Bitcoin thrives because the market for money is, in a sense, highly limited. You can't move money across international borders because you have to move it across central banks, and they offer a monopoly to only a few specific correspondent banks. So we have a highly inefficient global monetary system. It is effectively a backward system compared to the system that we had back in the 19th century. Because at least in the 19th century, all of the world functioned on the same currency. It was one international monetary standard, and everybody in the world used gold. Whereas today, you have to essentially barter with people who live on another side of a magic line in the sand. You can't just perform trade with them using money. You have to buy another good, which is their money first, and then buy theirs. So in this kind of environment, Bitcoin thrives because this kind of environment benefits from having a money like Bitcoin that can get around government controls. But the question is, would it thrive without government controls? In a completely free market, if government wasn't actually messing with gold, we could build all of the digital payment solutions that we want on top of physical gold, and without the gold having to move, that could happen. You could have all the privacy you want if government wasn't interfering. You could have private companies building gold payments, settling in gold, and keeping your data private. You can build all of these things on top of gold, and the limitation, in my opinion, is not technical. It's not about the movement of gold. The limitation is political. The limitation is simply that government wouldn't let it happen. And so it's an interesting question to imagine, what would the free market really choose between gold and Bitcoin? If we had a completely free market and we had no choice, we had complete choice, there was no government control, would Bitcoin's value proposition really win in that kind of situation over gold? And I think it's a useful thought experiment to think about. The case for gold ultimately goes down to liquidity. It's the same reason that we like to use to mock the shitcoins. Well, I'm here to use it against Bitcoin today. In a sense, gold has much higher liquidity than Bitcoin. And so if you were to think about it, imagine a situation today in which you have a completely free market in money, and Bitcoiners and people are free to choose whichever kind of money that they want to choose. What are they more likely to choose? Well, they're likely to choose the thing that just helps them get along and eat, basically. People are not going to be very ideological in a situation like that. They just need to choose the thing that is the most convenient. And given that the size of the liquidity of gold is far larger than Bitcoin, given that the number of people that own gold is far larger than Bitcoin, it's far more likely that that liquidity will beget more liquidity, that people will sell other monies for gold, and more liquidity will move toward gold because it has the highest liquidity. So in that sense, it could be that Bitcoin's gold's giant liquidity edge might be enough. Of course, there's also the 6,000-year first mover advantage. It's physical, it's intuitive, you don't have to worry about code and private keys and all of those things. It has tradition going for it. Millions of Indian and Chinese and Muslim brides all over the world only get married with gold, and when people get born, they're gifted gold. It's kind of a useful killer app for a store of value to have that. And essentially, its physicality is really only a disadvantage politically. It's not much of a disadvantage operationally. The free market can use gold as money, and we'll find technologies to make it a problem, to make it usable. But, if only the government would let us. But of course, the case for Bitcoin is the government is not going to let us. And that's precisely the point. And that's why we Bitcoin. So ultimately, what it comes down to is that the cost of running a full node for Bitcoin is far cheaper than gold. And that really helps me communicate or understand Bitcoin's value propositions. To just compare what it would take to be able to build a central bank that is able to settle internationally in gold versus a central bank that's able to do, or a bank that is able to do this with a Bitcoin. It's far lower as a cost. And it's very cheap to be able to settle payments globally. And it's cheaper to verify. You know, with gold, you have to assay the bars, and that can be expensive. And, you know, they keep getting better at cheating them. And then, of course, the other killer edge that Bitcoin has is that it has a far lower supply growth rate than Bitcoin, than gold. Eventually, Bitcoin gets to a 0% supply growth rate, which, you know, means that there's the dynamic that I mentioned in my book of the irresponsiveness of the Bitcoin demand to supply, that continues, and that would suggest that Bitcoin would likely continue to appreciate more and more over time and is used in a speculative manner. Whether that is enough to overcome the liquidity question is not entirely clear, because without government manipulation of money, without government restrictions on the movement of money in a free market of money, you know, the whole uncensorable payment value proposition of Bitcoin, not such a big deal anymore. And that's really the question. So in a sense, the more we move toward a free market system, the more that Bitcoin's uncensorable payment edge is eroded, and then its edge goes back to the cost of running a full node, which of course is related, because that's ultimately what protects Bitcoin from government attack, and that's why it matters so much. So this makes me think that one way of understanding how this attack functions, or how this attack could succeed, is that the longer we continue with this kind of monetary policy, where people have in their memory, in their recent memory, most people in the world have experienced some form of hyperinflation or very high inflation. The more that we continue with this world, with all this constant financial crises and economic crises that happen, the more that this continues, the more Bitcoin can grow its liquidity. And the more Bitcoin can grow its liquidity, the better of a chance it has to compete against gold in a free market eventually. And so the good news basically is that the longer we stay in this kind of 20th century monetary policy around government control of money, the more time Bitcoin has to build larger and larger liquidity, the more times it can grow in order to be able to become more of a monetary asset. And so in a sense, we can see that if monetary policy improves a lot, if, you know, we get a massive improvement in monetary policy, if we get, you know, all of the restrictions on the movement of money, if they're released, and if there's less inflation, if there are no more Venezuelas, no more Zimbabwe's, if people don't have a problem with spending their money abroad, and all of these issues become less and less problematic, you would imagine that Bitcoin would be under threat from the reduction in the economic incentive for people to use it, or want to transact in it, or want to protect it, or to innovate for it. On the other hand, there is also the other kind of danger of, in the case of, you know, we get a complete hyperinflationary scenario and then people have a free choice in money, then that is also a bit of a threat for Bitcoin, because in that situation, maybe gold's liquidity is far more important as an edge than Bitcoin's edge, which is eroded because we don't longer care about uncensorable payments. So the bad news, I think, in this is that, I think if you think about it this way, you know, when we generally like to think that Bitcoin is government resistant, you know, and I think there are very good reasons to understand why it is like that, and of course it's true. But however, Bitcoin, I think, is kind of dependent on government in spite of its resistance to it, because it depends on government for the incentive for people to use it. You know, Bitcoin requires government to continue to do stupid things in order for people to want to use Bitcoin. And I know I'm scared, some of you, but the good news is you don't have anything to worry about. We're counting on governments to do stupid things. Everything is under control. Everything is going according to plan. They're going to continue with this. And essentially, you know, they're going to, you know, they don't run terrible monetary policy just because they want to advertise Bitcoin, although probably Bitstein might disagree. He thinks they're doing it because they're closet maximalists. But I think they generally do it because they benefit from it. But they're kind of doing us a favor, because that's ultimately the only advertisement that Bitcoin needs. And that's what continues to keep Bitcoin going. And so, in a sense, the continuation of the status quo, as long as monetary policy continues it's bad enough that we don't have a free market choice, and it's not good enough for people to want to get out of, for people to not think that they need to get out of the mainstream fiat monetary system. If it's not good enough and if it's not bad enough, then essentially the status quo continues to favor Bitcoin. Governments continue to subsidize and support Bitcoin. And finally, another thing that governments continue to support and subsidize is my website, Saifedean.com. And I'm going to show you my website right now, because just like governments continue to support Bitcoin by supporting bad monetary and banking policies, they support my website by continuing to teach you bad economics in your university and making your university, wherever you are in the world, not teach proper Austrian economics, therefore forcing you to turn to my website, Saifedean.com, if you want to learn about Austrian economics. So I'm offering now online courses, accepting Bitcoin only as well. And it's also, my book is out in 8 languages now, and it will soon be out in another 5 languages. And if anybody is in the region, on Tuesday we have the release in Helsinki for the Finnish translation of the book. Thank you very much.
Would anyone like to ask Saifedean a question? I'm sure somebody will. Who's going to...
Just a question, but don't you think that Bitcoin has the ulterior advantages that the value is embedded into the protocol, so a token on gold, physical gold, has the redeem problem and the redeem trust in the issuer or in the custodian?
Yes, ultimately, yeah, but I think eventually we're going to have some kinds of these solutions developed on top of gold or on top of Bitcoin, in terms of, neither a physical gold transaction nor an on-chain Bitcoin transaction is likely to scale to handle your coffee payment. And so the edge is, ultimately what it comes down to is the issue of the cost of running the full node. So that's what it is, because in Bitcoin, because the cost of running the full node is so much lower, the system can handle so many thousands more of full nodes that allows you to have much closer, essentially much smaller circles of trust around any kind of second layer solutions, which makes it much more resistant to any kind of security attack, but also social attack and political attack. And that's ultimately really the advantage that I see in terms of the cost of running the full node, basically.
Hey Saif, question. If you would be at the side of central banks, what would you do?
I'm not. I'd quit.
No, because...
Honestly, I find it very hard to think from the perspective of a central banker, because I don't know what they think about. I've never been to a central bank. I don't know what their mandate really tells them. I don't know how their offices are like. So I don't know what they actually care about. It's their problem to figure out, and I'm not going to answer a question that I'm not qualified to answer. I don't work for a central bank.
Thank you.
Hey, don't you think the combination of free market forces and maybe an exponential wealth creation, that plus the fact that Bitcoin is finite in quantity, like I think these combined would cancel out the other benefits of gold versus Bitcoin?
Potentially, but if it's you can imagine many situations where it might not, in the sense that liquidity is much larger in the case of gold, and if Bitcoin, if adoption of Bitcoin doesn't grow very quickly, adoption of hash rate grows, hash rate doesn't grow very quickly. You can see a situation where you have a lot of ASICs that are left over, and it becomes quite easy to attack and reorg the chain. So then, it's security is down, interest is down. It could, it's more likely, I would say. I still don't think it's likely, but I think it's more likely than any kind of, as an attack, I think this kind of move toward a better monetary policy has a better chance of succeeding than any other kind of attack, even if it might still be unlikely. I'm not very convinced. Yes, you're right.
Saif, hey. Yeah. So I agree that human human motivation will always be more powerful than the state controlling it. But don't you think that the state would be able to control human motivation by doing stuff like they do with the climate panic right now, like shaming people into doing things, like shaming people not to use Bitcoin? Like
this is why we get so many trolls on Twitter. This is probably why, you know, the society tries to troll us into conforming and shaming us for using Bitcoin, but you know, we're not going to stand up for it, are we? Yeah.
Hey, thanks. What about technology? If quantum computing, you know, has come, and will it threaten the Bitcoin network?
I mean, honestly, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm definitely not amongst the top 100 qualified people to answer this question in this room. I prefer to focus on the economic incentives, but I'll say this, you know, if quantum computing, I don't know enough about it as a technical topic, but I'll just put it as a technology to discuss the economics of it. If quantum computing becomes available, if it is a technology that is available, there's no reason to assume that as an economic good, as a technology, it will behave any differently than regular computing. Meaning, if you can destroy Bitcoin with quantum computing, you can destroy Bitcoin with regular computing. If you can hack Bitcoin with quantum computing, you can hack it with regularly. Because there will be a market for the production of quantum computing processing power in the same way that there is a market for the production of regular processing power. And in the same way that you can apply quantum computing for essentially defensive purposes, you can apply it for offensive purposes. And so ultimately, you know, I think, imagine there is a, you know, the conflict, it doesn't matter what the tools are, as long as the economic incentives are in a certain way. I suspect that the economic incentives will find the use of the technology in the way that people choose. That's how I think of these kinds of technical issues. It's ultimately about the economic incentives to use these things. Because, you know, theoretically we can imagine scenarios in which we can hack and destroy Bitcoin, and yet the reason they don't continue to they don't happen in practice is the economic incentives against them are massively stacked. That's a very important factor. Okay, yeah.
Hi, Saif.
Hi.
What would be your what position would you take if faced with the following situation? Let's say there is a proposal for a protocol, a level 2 protocol that will considerably scale Bitcoin, so it would help with the scaling, but at the same time, not only because of its technical properties of that supposed protocol, but also based on its different monetary properties. For example, let's say like this. In that magical protocol, the tokens are constantly getting created and destroyed, created at the moment when a user gets into the loan obligation with the protocol, and the token disappears.
Is this a shitcoin shell?
No.
Okay.
No. Because it is a level 2 protocol, so therefore cannot exist by its own, but it has to have a token. And the monetary properties of this token are such that it is essentially a debt-based money. So the token gets created when the loan gets distributed, and the tokens gets destroyed in the act of loan repayment. What would be your first reaction on such an idea?
Okay. First of all, sorry about the comment. This is actually an interesting question. So the idea is, if we built a debt-based second layer on top of Bitcoin, similar to a credit-based economy that exists on top of government money, I presume, and you know, I think the problem with this would be that without government control and government protection, it would not survive. I think credit can be used as money, but without government protection, it will collapse, and then eventually we go back to using hard assets as money, and then eventually credibility in the market is only demonstrated through people who always have enough hard assets backing their credit. So you could build a network like this, and if you start creating fiat Bitcoin effectively, or you know, fractional reserve Bitcoin, there is nothing that can protect you from suffering a bank run, because there's no central bank that can print new Bitcoins to meet your obligations. So as long as you're short Bitcoin, you can always be subject to this kind of crisis. So I think in a free market, which Bitcoin enforces because nobody can create new Bitcoins, in a free market like this, I think second layer debt-based token Bitcoin that increased the supply would collapse, and this kind of thing wouldn't survive in a free market. That's what I would think the case would be. So I mean, I think people are welcome to try it, but I would not take part in it myself.
Hi, Saifedean. In 1908, the situation was perfect. No incentive for Bitcoin.
No, it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't as bad as 2008. That's the key.
Would it possible now to have the same situation in the case the government go back to the gold standard and they sort of create a coin, a token, anything to get rid of debts? Because Lagarde for 2 times pronounced in a public speech this good idea to have one crypto for all the central bank or monetary fund. This is very suspicious to me.
No, I agree entirely. Bitcoin. They should all just use Bitcoin and stop arguing, really. There's nothing else to talk about. Imagine introducing another token, like we need another new token. We already have enough. And Bitcoin is the only one that can do this, replace debt. Because currently, the current monetary system is built on monetization of debt. Anybody who issues debt is effectively issuing new money. And Bitcoin allows us to monetize something else, something that is a hard asset that doesn't involve the creation of debt. And it's something that's also, so gold is a hard asset, but Bitcoin is a hard asset, and it's a hard asset that can be spent, that can be sent halfway around the world. So, I expect them to continue to dig around this for many years, but Bitcoin will be doing it all along. It's an asset that's being monetized rather than the monetization of debt.
Yeah, we're good.